And without further ado, I'd like to invite Mark to talk to us about what we're facing at the moment. What's the issue?
Thanks, Hung, and thanks to you all for your interest in the third runway issue and logging into tonight's session. Flight Free Australia joined up with Frank and Hannah's Hume Residence Airport Action Group and Melbourne Airport Community Action Group last year when we became aware of the third runway proposal at Melbourne Airport. We started up 2.5 years ago to raise awareness of aviation's contribution to climate change, a forgotten contributor to global warming. So we want to stop the runway because of the increased global warming it will enable. Why is that necessary? Well, first up, we're in a climate emergency that requires massive and urgent emissions reductions. And second, third runway flights can't be emissions free anytime soon. So first, the climate emergency. Last year, global greenhouse gas emissions rose by a record amount. The Great Barrier Reef is now in a death spiral. Repeated devastating and expensive climate impacts are becoming the new norm for Australians. Global warming of 1.5 degrees can no longer be avoided. For an acceptable probability of avoiding climate chaos, we need to cut our emissions at emergency speed. That includes aviation emissions, reduced, not increased. The IPCC says it, the United Nations, the International Energy Agency, they all say it. No new infrastructure that creates fossil fuel emissions. But Melbourne Airport isn't listening. Flying is the most warming single thing you can do, and the third runway will create annual global warming from flights equivalent to our dirtiest coal-fired power station, AGL's Loy Yang, that most of us want closed. But Melbourne Airport is unwilling to admit that its third runway emissions will be this high. It's trying to deceive the public by first counting only CO2 emissions enabled by the runway when other flight emissions at altitude are twice as warming as CO2 alone. And second, by counting the CO2 emissions only from landing and takeoff, meaning total warming of third runway flights is estimated to be around 50 times more than Melbourne Airport is willing to admit. The second reason for opposing the runway, given we need to reduce emissions, is that third runway flights can't be emissions-free anytime soon, and certainly not by the time they want the third runway operating. So-called sustainable aviation fuels, planes powered by hydrogen, even green hydrogen, as well as flight offsetting, all create more emissions. And none of them, nor renewables-powered electric planes, can be rolled out at scale for years, if ever. So Melbourne Airport's third runway proposal is a denial of our climate reality. And can you believe it? They claim their third runway won't even be at risk in a 4-degree world, where we'll get to on our current high emissions, business as usual, flights as usual pathway. Let me remind you about the fundamentals of life on a hotter planet. At 4 degrees, those Victorians, amongst the perhaps 1 billion remaining globally, would have survival on their minds, not a European holiday. A 4-degree world, to quote Kevin Anderson, is incompatible with an organised global community, is likely to be beyond adaptation and devastating to the majority of ecosystems, and has a high probability of not being stable. Yet somehow, in this world, the airport will still be open for business. They're living in this climate denial bubble. And here's the clincher. They admit that regulating emissions reductions, in other words, acting to reduce the risk of climate collapse, acting to make us safe, threatens the operation of their third runway. So what do? Decide to halt the runway? No, Melbourne Airport recklessly pushes the proposal forward, expecting it to be approved. Just like we willingly observe total fire bans to prevent bushfires during summer, so we need to willingly observe total new runway bans to prevent runaway warming during the climate emergency. We're not alone. Other airport expansions are being resisted around the world, in Brisbane, in Sydney, the UK, Europe, North and South America, and in Asia. With your help, we can get Australia's next Federal Transport Minister to knock back approval of the third runway. Thanks.